welcome to session 43 of Worlds of Speculative Fiction. This time we're looking at, and I'm sure I'm going to screw up his name a little bit. I even had to look up how to pronounce it, and so maybe one of you can correct me if you know. China Mieville, does that sound right? Mieville. I think I saw something like that. So we're looking at the Bas-Lag novels, two of which I have here, Perdido Street Station and The Scar, and then there's The Iron Council as well. And so, you both know how we do this. We've got some biography. I came up with some interesting passages that tie in with philosophical themes and world building for China Mieville. And I managed to find a map, a decent map that was printable of the Bas-Lag universe, or at least the two continents and the ocean that are the main bit of it. Sometimes, when I first thought of this series and called it Worlds of Speculative Fiction, I thought, well, world building is always really central. And some of the people that we've looked at didn't do an awful lot of world building at all. And with this, it's almost the opposite. It's not Tolkien level where he's actually written out grammars of languages or anything like that, but this is pretty lush world building that's going on with many different interesting races and geography and a whole back history, and so there's I think we have a lot to talk about with that. And there's sometimes we have to struggle a little bit with finding philosophical themes, but again, we have an embarrassment of riches with this, because he's got philosophers in the thing and all sorts of philosophical disquisitions and dialogues going on. But there's also some big grand themes that I think are flowing through it, like the nature of politics and what cities are like. One of the things I actually wanted to talk about, because he's staked out a position on this, is Post-Modernism, because he gets called a postmodern author, but he explicitly rejects that title, and for certain reasons that have to do with what postmodernism turned into, largely in the British scene. And it's interesting. I didn't realize that he and I went to college around the same time, and he's 2 years younger than I am. So, a lot of the things that he did at certain times, I can think about, what was going on in the culture around that time, and some of it, I think you can see flowing into it. So, should we start with the biography? And, it's fairly short because he hasn't lived that long, and he hasn't died, so... Unlike, what's that?
Knock on wood.
Yeah, exactly. But he seems like he's pretty healthy. He's fit, and I think he eats right, and all that sort of stuff. So he's born in Norwich, and his parents, he said in a couple different interviews, were hippies. So they were playing around with a book, and that's how he got the name China, because they thought it just seemed like a cool thing. His middle name is Tom, so I'm sure he probably... Absolutely, if you'd like to. No, sure. Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks. And his parents separate soon after that. His father really doesn't play much of a role in his life, but his mother moves them to London, and he goes first to what would be our public schools, and then begins attending private schools on scholarships when he's about 11 or so. And then pretty early on, his parents really were hippie types, and he always had sort of a leftist perspective. And when he was quite young, 13, he begins engaging in this in serious ways with political campaigns and marches and demonstrations. If you think about what the 80s was like, I mean, it's one thing for people to be politically engaged, say on Twitter or Facebook, where there's almost no cost, right? People can portray themselves as being a activist. Instagram is another great example too, but or I suppose YouTube, right? You can make a YouTube video and be like, down with this, and we should do this. And there's whole universes out there, but you actually at some point in time actually have to get out into the street and sign things and present your not just your image but your actual body in places in order to do things. And so the 80s, there was quite a lot of that going on. Eventually, his mother is going to move out of London, and at that time he begins attending a boarding school, which he said was pretty terrible, but allowed him to continue his education. And he graduates in 1990, and then does a gap year, teaching English for a year in Egypt and traveling to Zimbabwe. And around that time, he starts mapping out the world that's going to figure into these novels, the Bas-Lag universe. He then goes to study at Clarke College, Cambridge, and originally he starts doing English, which, good choice for a writer, right? And he says that he couldn't really stand it because of the way that things are being taught at the time. So he goes and do social anthropology instead. And it's kind of, I'll mention something that happened to me when I was in college in a much different situation, a little rural school, rather than being in the heart of London or anything like that, or in this case, Cambridge. I would go to these writing classes because a lot of my friends were in English, and I was doing philosophy and mathematics. And there was a professor there who we all kind of idolized. He was one of these, didn't care about anything, had tenure, would tell people that their poetry was no good, and then every once in a while surprise them by saying that this part here is, you might be able to do something with it. And I wasn't dependent on him for praise or anything like that because I wasn't one of the English majors. And everybody else sort of hung on his words. And I went to him one day in his office and I said, listen, I really want to be a writer. And I'm thinking about changing my major from philosophy. And the philosophy department there was not very good at all. I'm going to change from philosophy to English. What do you think about that? He said, oh, that's a terrible idea. And I said, why? He said, well, all these people who are in the writing program, all they're learning is writing. And they're reading this certain canon of stuff. You're reading other stuff that'll actually probably pay off for you more as a writer. You should actually, I don't care if it's philosophy or history or sociology. Jesus, don't study writing. Study that thing and then write on the side, and it'll turn out a lot better.
I heard that too when I was.
You got that advice?
Yep.
Interesting.
And I'm a copy editor, so I meet people who write.
And you did the PPE program, right?
I did, yeah.
Okay.
And I have to say for myself, people who come out of MFA programs are not necessarily better writers than people who didn't.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah, I think you can generalize that about other professional degrees as well, because the MFA is essentially a professional degree. It's a finishing degree. There are some things that you learn doing an MBA. Reading certain statements, certain types of marketing. There's a lot of jargon that you learn, but that doesn't necessarily make a person better at a lot of the operational stuff for business. And there are some people who don't want to hire MBAs for that reason.
Wow.
And they hire liberal arts majors instead. A lot of it has to do with effectiveness of communication and problem solving. So in any case, he studies social anthropology, and he's a sort of a fast track guy. He gets done pretty early, graduates from Cambridge in 3 years, begins working as an editor on a computer magazine, and he starts working on his master's degree in international law at the London School of Economics at the same time. 1995, his father dies. And he also receives his master's degree and then begins working on his PhD. In there, I don't have it in here, but he actually did a fellowship at Harvard for about a year as well. And he publishes his first major novel, King Rat, in 1998. Perdido Street Station is going to follow not that long after that. And in 2001, he gets his PhD in international law, which he'll publish later on as Between Equal Rights, a Marxist Theory of International Law, a nonfiction work. He's got a few nonfiction works in there. And that same year, he does a couple other things. He gets the Arthur C. Clarke Award and British Fantasy Award for Perdido Street Station. So this really establishes his reputation. And he's also a candidate for the House of Commons for the Socialist Alliance. I think that in his seat, if I remember right, he gets about 3% of the vote, which for a minority party is actually not that bad. He's got to go around canvassing, doing all the sorts of things that you do. Then he follows that up with the Scar and the Tane in 2002. The Scar wins awards as well. And so, the series is off to a good start. And, it's interesting, too, when you think about the series. These are set in the same universe, and I don't have the Iron Council, but it's the same universe as well, and there's all these reference points that are together. But it's sort of like the when we talked about Ian Banks' Culture series, there's a common universe, and there's some back and forth reference points, but the characters don't really interact or anything like that. They're stories within a shared narrative space. As time goes on, he writes quite a few other works. London, sort of play on words on London. Then he writes Red Planets, Marxism and Science Fiction, which is another nonfiction work. And that same year, that's okay, in 2009 he writes The City in the City, which has been adapted. I have one adaptation of it that got adapted in 2013 at the Lifeline Theater in Chicago. So that's kind of interesting. And there's talk about doing like film or TV adaptations, but as it often works with these things, those take a long time, and it seems difficult to actually pull them off. But he goes on, and he is writing professionally. Doing more and more and more, and then eventually, starts getting more involved in the political scene than he already was. He resigns from the Socialist Workers' Party in 2013 over a scandal that took place about rape allegations, and then he joined with some other people, including other creative types, but other politicos as well, in forming this left unity, which doesn't seem to have gone too far, but Britain is kind of a tough place to pull that sort of thing off. The left seems right now pretty disorganized, and he gave quite a few interviews in recent times about what was going on and about Brexit and things like that. So he's written quite a few things recently as well, none of which have to do with the Bas-Lag universe. The Census Taker, Last Days of New Paris, another nonfiction work, October, the story of the Russian Revolution, and this year he's got another one, A Spectre Haunting Europe.
Is that nonfiction?
I believe so. Yeah, and I think he is I guess you can say he's a Marxist. He's not necessarily like an orthodox Marxist of the putting capital in everybody's face sort of thing. But there's a great deal more flexibility in the Marxist movement over there, and that's a famous reference, of course, to Marx's Communist Manifesto. A specter is haunting Europe, that of communism, and so actually that's sort of a good launching point into the thing about postmodernism. So let's talk about that, and then we'll come to the narrative universe right away, because it'll be a nice segue too. So this is from an interview in 2003. He says, "I don't really accept the term postmodern as explaining very much in the real world. I'd use it as a description for certain schools of theory and certain schools of art. I don't consider myself a postmodernist in any real sense." So already there, he's doing something that I myself respect quite a bit, which is to not use this term postmodern in a sort of sloppy, it covers everything, kind of loosey-goosey sense that a lot of people do, either positively, because they say, oh, we all have to be postmoderns or pomo, or negatively, the way that we've seen in the last 10 years, where people are not. In the past, people would complain about relativism or secular humanism, and now they just say postmodernism as if that's like this bugaboo that covers everything. And there is movements that are postmodern in art and in literature and in philosophy, but that's sort of high theory stuff. That's not just somebody getting on YouTube and talking about memes or something like that, and there being some self-reference. That's not enough to actually make it postmodern. That's very modern, actually. And he thinks that it doesn't explain very much. And then he's changing it a little bit to talk about the people who are postmodernists. He says, postmodernism has done quite a good job of colonizing lots of techniques and implying that anything like those techniques is therefore postmodernist. So, if there's an unreliable narrator, right, it's postmodern. But unreliable narrators have been around for quite a while, and you could easily harness it for. Here's a great example. If you want to call, Louis Ferdinand Céline's Journey to the End of Night a postmodernist novel because there's some skipping around and a pretty unreliable narrator and some kind of surrealistic stuff going on, that really glosses over how not conservative and not even traditional, but sort of like nihilistic the novel is, but nihilistic in a conservative way. And that's early 20th century literature, right? So just because something has a few traits of what we consider postmodern doesn't make it postmodern, but I think a lot of people glommed onto that. And I remember that, in the 90s, that was sort of like the big thing. Everything needed to be postmodern, and nobody could tell you what it meant. So he says you can see certain deconstructive techniques, for example, without being a postmodernist, still being, and here he lays his hand down, being a classical Marxist. So he says, I realize that this is a bit of a semantic quibble. If someone finds it useful to describe my stuff in that way, that's up to them, but I'd resist it because I don't think it's fair that hybridity, uncertainty, blurring identities, fracturing, formal experimentation, or the blurring of high and low cultures should be ceded to postmodernism. That's an interesting thing to say. And he says, I want all that, and I'm a classical Marxist. And you might say, well, what's the problem? Because nowadays we have all these people who are like, blurring cultural Marxism and postmodernism, and they're equating the two, and then people point out, well, no, these are actually quite different. Marxists believe that there is something that postmodernists typically reject. There's a grand narrative, and in the grand narrative, there are some features to it that run throughout. Like Marx says that history is a history of class struggles. You don't have to buy into that 100% and say it's only a history of class struggles. But if you say that class struggle doesn't play a role, you're probably not a Marxist at that point, right? No matter how you package yourself. And so the postmodernists, quite often, like he says, the postmodern term was used too often as a stick with which to beat Marxism. That meant that when I became a Marxist, there was a certain polemical importance to pointing out that many of the critical tools associated with postmodernism could also be used by those of us cheerily hanging on to meta-narratives, stories about what's actually going on. Like the working class has been progressively, screwed over in a lot of ways in the last, say, 30 years. Wages have stayed stagnant, but cost of living has gone up in all these different ways. That could be a Marxist narrative, right? And a postmodernist would have to say, oh, well, who are we to judge? And, maybe you shouldn't have so much certainty about that. And Marxists would say, no, we could be wrong about this, but we're gonna take our stand on this. So he says, I'm going to skip down a little bit. It's the big claims of postmodernism, and to be fair, generally what I consider the vulgar end of postmodern light, Baudrillard and his epigons, that I wanted to dissociate myself from. And then he says it was particularly sharp in social anthropology, where the cultural relativism led to some terrible capitulations to inequity. I reject postmodernity as a description of the world. We live, I would argue, in late capitalism, and the post label adds nothing particularly useful. So that's a very clear statement, I think, he's telling us where he stands. There's other theorists who kind of fit into that. Somebody that I remember, saying a lot of those sort of things back in the 90s was Terry Eagleton, who was a Marxist esthetician, and he would look at these texts that everyone was saying, well, we can't really figure out what they're about. He'd say, no, we can say these things are about this, and we can say that these cultural processes lead to this, and this is actually problematic, and we should probably try to change this in the publishing industry. There were some other, good books along those lines. Samuel Harrington had that, The Politics at God's Funeral, where he was worrying about that. And I think that came out, I want to say, late 80s or early 90s. And so Mieville is kind of locating himself within a particular tradition. One important expositor of postmodernism. When people ask me, they talk about the postmodern, I say, well, it's more complicated than you think. They always say, well, who should I read then? And I usually say, well, you could read Lyotard, who coined the phrase in the postmodern condition, right? Or you could read Frederick Jameson's massive book, Postmodernism, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. And one of the things that I think is, I was thinking about this on the drive over. So one way that Jameson talks about postmodernism, after surveying what other people mean by it, he says that you can think of it as a recognition that nobody really knows what's going on. And so the distrust of master or meta-narratives wouldn't just be like, well, you can't ever tell a story, man, because the story is always going to be false in some way, right? It's not this sort of knee-jerk response. It's rather a recognition that every way in which we frame things doesn't just already contain some contradictions or some blind spots that we needed to fill in. It's that we don't really know. There's always a sort of a shadow, a penumbra at the outside. We don't really know what's determining what. We know what we see. We know that there are systems, complicated systems that we can wrap our heads around. We don't know how far those actually extend or how true they are. And yet we still have to make choices and operate within them. That's what Jameson talks about. And man, does that look like the world in these books, right? Nobody truly knows exactly what's going on because everything is in some respect too vast for any one single mind to take it all in. But everybody's got some sort of scheme and some local understanding of their portion of the world. That could be wrong and could be investigated further, but and will change the world as well by what they do. But nobody truly knows what's going on, probably including, bless you, Mieville. And so I was thinking on the way over, and so here'd be something to kick off some discussion. We normally think of an author as essentially like the god overseeing their creation, right? And we can have different sorts, like, the difference between Tolkien as the architect and George R. Martin as the gardener who plants seeds and then just sees how things develop. But it's still George R. Martin using his brain space for these characters to grow, right? So we shouldn't like pretend that somehow he just plotted a bunch of things in holes somewhere and watered them and they grew up and then he like documented it. No, it's within his writing process. So Mieville knows this world, right, in these books, these very thick books, because he's the one who came up with it. But he's able to portray to us a world that not only for the characters but also for us as the readers, always remains, all sorts of complex systems that do remain outside of our grasp. And he's good at portraying characters knowing things that they talk about and then don't talk about further. So I'll put the question this way: Is he in some respect a postmodern author in that he doesn't actually know what's going on with his own creation, or is there some sort of sleight of hand going on in it, narratively? What do you think?
And I do get the impression I was actually surprised to see a map, much less a fairly complete map. I always have the impression that
this is speculative,
that would
right?
Because there are some points where I think he describes it. The world takes place on a flat plane, and it's basically impossible to find a limit to it, which gave me the sense that, as an author, at the very least, he was leaving himself an out to develop and discover more things in it.
Some of why you can't go certain places, though, like so. North of New Crobizon is the Grangris. And, that plays a major part in the Scar. That's where the Grindy Low live. And they're these weird creatures that are incredibly dangerous. You could say capricious, but we don't even know enough about them to say whether they're capricious or not. They will trade with human beings on weird terms and give them good things, and then if you transgress any of their rules, none of which the human beings actually know, they will essentially just eat you. And they're horrific and strong and track you for thousands of miles across the ocean. So that closes off the north. You're not getting past them, right? It's sort of like it'd be like if you had a video game, you just have like bosses on bosses on bosses that can't be beaten at that point. Well, that's no longer explorable, right? So I think that's part of it. But what about like the structure of like the city or Armada in this? You've got this vast place where the story takes place with all these interlocking systems. Can anybody understand how all they fit together? Do you think Mieville does, or like if it was Tolkien writing it, Tolkien would understand it, right?
That's true, yeah.
But Tolkien's world is in some respect a little simpler, isn't it?
Yeah, and it even feels a little underpopulated compared to Mieville, I think, because Mieville pays
Interesting.
attention. Well, class.
Yeah.
And it is sort of class-wise. Mieville has more characters, and he has more types of characters. Tolkien is still mostly focused on the nobility or the gentry of their respective
sort of
area.
like old-fashioned history, right?
Yeah, while Mieville, you'll not only get who's the people in charge of the city, but you'll also get everybody who lives on every level of it.
Yeah, you get a lot of what they called in the late 19th century and early 20th century the demi-monde, the people who were typically anywhere from like lower class all the way up to sometimes upper middle class, but rarely that. Usually like lower middle class or perhaps making it into middle class, and they served the people who were the elite, whether they were the moneyed or the rich or the powerful or the old families or something like that. So you think about people who would be like professional caterers or courtesans or musicians. I mean, they never really had that much social capital, but they had access to those places and those people. I think there's a lot of characters like that in here. But you have academics, like Isaac. There's a whole, university scene going on, which is kind of interesting. Universities are always kind of a weird, mixy place when it comes to class, aren't they? Think about it this way: like if you have a traditional factory town, right? Well, you know who the rich people are; they own the factories. And then there's the people who do all the services for them that are important enough to pay a lot for, like their accountants and lawyers and doctors and this and that. And then there's another strata below them, and then there's the strata of people who do the majority of the work, and then there's a lower strata yet of people who do other work and get looked down upon by even the workers. So that's pretty straightforward. And in an academic area, you still have some of that, but a lot of things are kind of upset. You have people coming in who, by virtue of the fact that education can sometimes raise you out of your social class into a different social class, can move up, or people fall down. It's not. What is a chair of a department? They're a boss, but what sort of social status do they have in town? It's probably fairly low, unless it's a prestigious department. So there's that, and then there's all this other stuff going on as well within the city, and that's just a city. So, yeah. Well, what else should we say about this world that he's built? I mean, it's vast. It encompasses, like you were saying, if Tolkien is underpopulated, this is teeming with.
Teeming is a good word.
Yeah.
It's like two things that it reminds me of. One is it reminds me a bit of medieval bestiaries, where you get men with mouths in their chests and stuff, and all this kind of weird stuff. So we've heard that this weird stuff is out there. Your average medieval person is not going to run into them, but they
a unicorn.
Yes, but they firmly believe they are out there because the educated people have these bestiaries of them. Bas-Lag is kind of like that, only they're real. And there is this sense that your local person on the ground is aware that there are monsters out there and might or might not ever meet them and is never going to fully understand them, but that's just how it is.
Yeah.
Even though it's not a medieval world, but it has that aspect.
When I was researching this, one of the things I came across that was kind of interesting was talking about the Grindylow again. And so there are these races that are clearly non-human but are well incorporated within human society, like the cactus people and the McCaffrey and I forget the name of the toad, or the frog-like creatures, the Voldani, was it?
Oh yeah, or Voldani or something. I think it's based on a Russian.
So they're more or less well understood, and people might have prejudice against them or exploit them, but they know where they fit in, and they know that they're more or less going to act similarly to human beings. And then there's the Grindylow, and one of the things I came across said it's not quite sure whether they should classify them as monsters or essentially a race that's sort of like humans, because their psychology is different enough that it's tough to fit them in. Mm-hmm. Whereas like the vampires and the was it Opdead? Not undead. The Opdead in High Chromalek. Okay, they're clearly within the realm. We might actually say, are they within the realm of not rational beings, but human-like beings, human-like enough beings? I mean, traditionally we've like think about Immanuel Kant, for example. If we run into aliens, either they're rational like us human beings, even if they've got weird floppy things all over the place and 8 eyes and I don't know, eat cubes of gelatin or something like that. We still have to treat them as persons, because they have the same basic structure of agency. They probably have a different psychology than we do, but we can strip that away, right? We can say that there's something distinctively rational and therefore person-like. I don't know that works that well for this. Where would we draw the line between monster and human-like being? Clearly, the Avanc in the Scar, that massive creature that they have underneath, trying to use it as a like a
transportation.
Yeah, it's providing the they've harnessed it essentially, right?
Yeah, the moving power.
That doesn't count as a human-like being in any way, and that's one reason why they can use it as a beast of burden. But these others, how do they fit in? And there's not a lot of talk about that. There's a lot of people just sort of act as if, well, there's these frog-like creatures. I guess we got to deal with them.
Actually, that matter-of-factness was the other thing that stuck with me. I think it's in Iron Council, where it's almost like this passing line. There's a mine, because it's sort of an Industrial Revolution-style world, and they're mining the marrow out of the bones of a dead god. And they just toss this aside like it's nothing.
Yeah.
And like they have the massive creatures like whatever's ribcage surrounding Necrobazon and the creature in the sky. But it's just like there's something so vast and metaphysically potent, and now it's dead, and now they're just using it for raw materials.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a theme that runs through a lot of this stuff, right? What would we call it? Like repurposing of the great?
That might be a sort of turning the stuff mundane. I'm almost trying to, some of it sort of comes back to Marxists, I think. You can't get much more material history than turning a dead god into materials and commodities.
Yeah.
Actually,
well, I was also thinking about the big ship that was like, it was a really big thing for, again, Necrobazon.
Yeah.
And sort of like their Titanic, I guess, in a way. And it gets lost and it gets incorporated into Armada as part of the structure of it, right? Furnishing raw materials. And so, materialism, this is another thing that's kind of interesting to think about. So Aristotle brings in this whole discussion of teleology that's quite complex and interesting. But Aristotle has a bias towards a thing really has its purpose, and anything else, you can do other stuff with it, but it's not really for that. And he criticizes, in the politics, he criticizes this... I forget the name of the knife, and it was sort of like a Swiss Army knife. It was a multi-purpose tool, and he says that it's not very good because, obviously you do better when you stick to one purpose, and you read that and you're like, hey, he's a pretty smart guy, but that doesn't really make sense because there are some things that really only work for one purpose, but so many other things can be easily repurposed in so many other ways. And it's like we introduce, as human beings, we introduce new teleology into the things that we work with. And that is a point that the Marxists, among others, make. That this repurposing or mission creep, or however we want to frame it, is something that's kind of endemic to us as creatures. And the other races, too, are doing that as well. They're adapting to new circumstances. Like the McCaffrey who come into New Crobazone and have to build a new life for themselves. I mean, they're master repurposers, making their art out of chewing stuff up and spitting it into shape, right? And then it becomes something that can be sold to the people, the humans, to make a buck. There were some other. Oh yeah, going back to the world building thing. There were two things I'd wanted to talk about in here. One was the Tolkien thing. So he actually wrote a piece called "There and Back Again: 5 Reasons Tolkien Rocks." Sort of a response to people who are like, Tolkien is a fascist, and his stuff is no good. We got to get totally away from that. And he listed things like incorporating Norse mythology. The creature in the water was another one of the great reasons. He talked about how good Tolkien was at like making monsters. And he says the author of the century needs no help from anyone, least of all a speck like me. No force on earth could undermine the juggernaut implacability of his sails, nor the world historical scale of his influence, nor the truly enormous weight of his achievement. He puts the word epic in epic win. However, or more accurately because of that, every few years, certain as tides, someone will write a splenetic screed against the professor, explaining why he's the devil, the worst things to happen to fantasy, the voice of reaction, oh my God, the most boring writer ever, etc. He says, the Oedipal resentment motivating many of these attacks may be trivial, obvious, especially from those from within fantastic fiction, but it doesn't follow the substance of all the criticism is baseless. There's perfectly reasonable arguments to be had about the impact, nature, scale, and success of Tolkien's work. The sheer religious zealotry with which some Tolkienistas defend the master when it ignores those grounds for debate and refuses to countenance a flaw anywhere within the Middle-earthian edifice doesn't then help matters. Even more nuanced pro-Hobbit partisans sometimes choose to look to some of us to be questionable grounds for defense, because there are arguments not only about what is regrettable in Tolkien, but what is indispensable. Accordingly, what follows, and he gives a list of some, perhaps in some cases, somewhat insufficiently stressed reasons why we all should be terribly grateful to Tolkien. So, that's kind of an interesting ground to stake out. But I think that, the interesting thing is when you're like a bona fide attached to some sort of tradition, and the Marxism is essentially a tradition at this point, like a McIntyrean tradition. And McIntyre himself was a Marxist. I think that's part of where some of his impetus has always come from. It allows you a certain freedom to reach across lines and take on things that people who are maybe a little less secure in their ideological commitments can't do. Why do people have to attack Tolkien so much and say, well, we have to get beyond him? Why not appropriate the things that are good and then also say, if you think about, I like reading Quora answers and questions about various things, and Lord of the Rings is one of them, and people will ask things about how that universe could actually function. What is it like for these orcs, for example? And it turns out that Tolkien himself had some real worries about that, because orcs actually, Tolkien's a good Catholic. Orcs have souls, corrupted souls, but it seems like they're really in a screwed position by virtue of being the kind of things that they are. And if Tolkien himself is worried about these sorts of things, I think it seems perfectly fine to worry about that. But we can recognize what Tolkien did for creating the possibility for epic fiction that I think can lead to. This isn't quite epic fiction. He describes it as new weird, but. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting that I put this is coming from another interview. He says that one of the most enduring influences on him was Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games, playing it as a kid. And so in 2003 he says, I've not played for 16 years and have absolutely no intention of starting again, But, so this goes right to the point about the bestiaries, I still buy and read the manuals occasionally. There were two things about them that particularly influenced me. One was the mania for cataloging the fantastic. If you play them for any length of time, you get to know pretty much all the mythological beasts of all the pantheons out there, along with a fair bit of theology. I still love that. I collect fantastic bestiaries. And one of the main spurs to write a secondary world fantasy, again, that's a Tolkien sort of term, right? Was to invent a bunch of monsters, half of which I'm sure I'll never be able to fit into any books. So that's an interesting point. And then he goes on and he says, the other more nebulous but very strong influence of RPGs was the weird fetish for systemization, the way everything is reduced to game stats. If you take something like Cthulhu in Lovecraft, for example, it's completely incomprehensible and beyond human categorization. But in the game, Call of Cthulhu, you see Cthulhu's strength, dexterity, and so on carefully expressed numerically. There's something banalifying about that approach to the fantastic. On one level, it misses the point entirely, but I must admit it appeals to me in its application of some weirdly misplaced rigor onto the fantastic. I think that's part of what's going on in this. There is a rigor to and systematization, but we don't actually get to see the system. We only know that a system is there, and people are referencing it and bringing up books and hypotheses and all of that sort of stuff. And so for Mieville, he says he got that in part by the influence of role-playing games, which I think is kind of funny. I also remember, this is total trivia, because I used to play D&D way back in the day when I was a kid, and I think they had to take this out of later editions because they got sued over it. But in the early advanced D&D game, the Cthulhu mythos was part of it. And they had stats for all these things. Mm-hmm. And then somebody sued them, I think, and they took it out. But it wouldn't really have fit that well into the D&D universe anyway, would it? That was all kind of arranged, right? All the different evil beings had their different planes, and all the good beings did. But Cthulhu, and all the other mythos beings, I don't know if we can call them gods, the old ones, they mess up everything. You bring them in and it's a mess, So that's, I think that gives you a little bit of interesting background insight into what's going on in these works. Obviously, it's much less about fighting and more about spying and figuring out how to do research and remake people and make a buck and stuff like that than the role-playing games tend to be. And personal relationships too. There was another theme I wanted to bring up as well, and we've already touched on it a bit. And I'm not going to read the whole passage as I have with these others, but he got a lot of flack for how political Iron Council was viewed as being, and it seems, reading the other books, they're intensely political. There's all this political back and forth going on, not just in New Crobazone, in Perdido Street Station itself, right? And then descriptions about how things are working. But this book is about a floating city that has its own constituencies in these different sectors of the city made of old ships, and they have to work out what they're going to do as a hybrid people, whether they're going to raise and chain the Avant and go all the way to the Scar, or abandon this project. And there's a lot of back and forth political machination. I think when people complain about novels or films or stuff like that being political, I think a lot of the time it's because it's that it's not necessarily endorsing, but it's narrating a politics that they don't like. You know, Iron Council, you could say, is more socialist or more Marxist in that respect. But a good Marxist is always trying to see how, you know, society's arranged and how the institutions function, and that's just a materialist approach to things. Seems like in Iron Council, it gets viewed as political because he's portraying things that way. Just like when people get upset about, you know, I don't know, bringing female characters in to popular franchises and actually giving them command positions, or more you know, airtime or agency or more backstory. There's always somebody who's like, oh, why do you have to politicize everything? And in a way, it is politicizing it, because, you know, we all know that banal saying everything is political, right? But it's not politicizing it as opposed to other ways of telling the story. You know, just having a bunch of dudes running around shooting everything in sight, that's political too, you know. So he did say that some people were saying this is Mieville's breakthrough book. He's moved to a different level. And he said the critical reception at the pro level has been quite good. The critical reception at the fan level has been quite troubled. So I thought that was kind of an interesting take at it. And then he's saying this in 2005, just a year after the book has been published. So I was going to see, what do you make of that? Is it a more... He says this is the most overtly political book I've ever written. It's a book that features a lot of sexual politics, which some people won't necessarily like. But there's a lot of sexual politics in both of these two, isn't there?
Sexuality in Iron Council, I think the main character is bisexual.
Yeah.
So people had to deal with the fact that gay people exist and have relationships in his books, and that might have been
2004. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting how in the space of 25 years or so, the whole sort of like marriage equality and gay liberation and representation movement essentially succeeded in most places. You know, if you think, I guess, yeah, in the early 2000s, it was still such a hotly contested issue. Whereas now that one's, you know, more or less behind us. So if we can have a gay candidate for president, who, interestingly, a lot of gay people and other people in the LGBTQ whole thing are not supporting because they don't like him for various reasons. I mean, that's actually a sign that you've made it, right? When you're not going to be endorsed by your group, right? And yeah, I mean, you still do have a lot of people like railing against the gay agenda or homosexuality as sinful and stuff like that. But if you do it in a TV show or a movie or things like that, like let's say we made Iron Man gay, you know, I think a lot of Marvel fans would be quite upset at that, or bisexual or whatever. It's funny. I mean, you can push. There's like so many different like unwritten rules about where you could push an envelope as a writer and where you couldn't. You know, I suppose a lot of it depends on fan base, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, even now there's the pushback. I can't think of the novel that the lady wrote, but she wasn't that.
Oh,
American,
right.
Yeah.
Being sort of the wrong kind of immigrant and. Right?
Well, she herself wasn't an immigrant. She had a Puerto Rican grandmother, but she did research based on books, and there were a lot of gaps in her knowledge.
Okay.
So Latino and Mexican people were kind of offended that the book, which wasn't accurate to their experiences, was being hosted as the book about their experiences.
Oh, yeah,
Is
yeah.
it nonfiction?
It's fiction, but
Okay.
but it's fiction that's like so inaccurate. Basically, the argument is it's so inaccurate that it doesn't work well as fiction.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, like a lot of it does have to do, I think, with her nationality, because as they point out, like there are Mexican and Latino writers who could have written a book that could have been promoted heavily as the novel about the immigrant experience, and instead they chose a book by a
That-
woman who is culturally very white.
Yeah, I mean, that comes up a lot in film and television, too, right? Where, you know, you should... There's going to be a character who's, you know, say East Asian, and then they still pick a... you know, big Hollywood actress or actor to play them and give them some makeup and things like that, and you wonder why. I mean, you could say that that's probably something that still is an issue across the board, no matter what we want to pick.
Although sometimes I will say this, and I always see everything, I think, both ways. I love to play the devil's advocate, but speaking back to counseling,
Yeah.
the biggest qualm always in the counseling realm was, well, if you're a recovering addict, you can work with the, you know, alcohol and drug abuse clients. If you're this, you know, and I always say, well, you know, sorry to break it to you, but I'm not going to go home and tell my husband to beat the crap out of me so I can work with you. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not my thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So either you recognize I can have empathy, you know, and I do agree with doing your homework and obviously having an accurate portrayal, but
Well, some of that going on in certain spaces too, about the writing of certain kinds of abuse or trauma, and there are people who sort of have pushed, like, to make sure you're telling the experience authentically. I want to know your history. And
Yeah.
basically, they'll come out and go, you know, you don't have.
It's sort of
the
like
right
requiring
to know.
credentialing almost.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
like, you know, that's actually really messed up for you to say. You don't have the right to someone's
Yeah.
history
Yes.
in these ways.
You know, I always thought that you can't understand a particular point of view unless you have some, unless you're either coming from it or you've got some, like, irrefutable connection to it. Like, I'm not this, but I have a child who's this, or I'm married to this, right?
Yeah, and I
It
can get
gives people
questioned
certain
too.
status.
I have a black friend.
Yeah. Well, I've always...
Do you agree with that?
I always thought that from a philosophical perspective, it didn't make sense, because if we actually followed out that logic, then nobody would actually be able to relate to anybody. You know,
negates
we could always like split things down further and further and further and further, and so clearly that doesn't work. And then the more interesting thing isn't trying to refute it and say, see, I've proven that your thing is wrong, but to say, well, how would we make inroads then? How do we tell between a fairly reliable or faithful portrayal of this particular group or issue or something like that, and then stuff that we should call BS on.
It didn't happen that people within the group will see things differently.
Yeah.
So even when someone from the group is writing a certain experience, it'll work for some people and it really won't work for other people, and competing needs and feelings.
well, and then again, it really puts an emphasis on, now, am I the spokesperson? I
Yeah.
don't want to be the spokesperson
Yeah.
for a whole entire,
Yeah.
what we deem race.
That's something that
really
some of my
nice.
students have brought up
Race and
in
sexuality.
classes.
Exactly.
That they don't like being made into the token X.
Exactly.
That it's.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unfair for them to have to work harder than everybody else anyway because of that. But they also don't like getting pigeonholed into
Yes.
being,
That.
yeah.
Well, and I've had people even go as far as to say, like, to my son is black, and they said, because you have a white mom, you're not black.
Oh yeah, that's.
So there are a lot of opinions out there as to what things are.
Yeah.
You
Should ask them if they think the same about Obama then too, right?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I'm adopted mom, so he's
Yeah.
black.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, come on. But again, people have those opinions.
Yeah, I think
They don't know the family, and it's like, come on.
one of the things, we're getting kind of far away from Mieville, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. because we're now in this much more connected world, internet infused world, where the tempo of everything is sped up very very quickly. If you say something on Twitter, people know about it on the other side of the world if they're following you within minutes. I think there's a tendency for anything that we say to draw contradiction and criticism very quickly, and it can replicate itself. Whereas in the past, if I was let's say I'm portraying myself as an expert on Billy Budd, right? And I talk about it all the time, and people would be like, well, it's kind of a weird trait of his, but he's the Billy Budd guy, right? And let's say somebody else was there, and they're like, I don't think he actually knows much about this, and they say it, but nobody else is actually paying attention to them. So they're like, shut up, the professor's talking or something like that. He's been in the Navy. He knows about this sort of thing, right? And then somebody else is like, well, he's never actually had to execute somebody. And they're like, well, I'm sure he could put himself in their shoes. He knew somebody who executed somebody, or some nonsense like that. So in the past, so you could still get dragged down pretty quickly. And it happened to lots of people in lots of different ways, often quite unfairly. But now, really, any position that you take, you can encounter opposition to it, and very often poorly thought out, just sort of almost like picking up on only 1/10 of what you're saying kind of opposition very quickly. And I think that's the normal condition now. And it's, for those of us who are older and maybe know how to push back and not take it to heart too easily, it's just an annoyance, It wastes some of our time arguing with people who, you think they're arguing in good faith, but they're not, or something like that. But I think for a lot of young people that are growing up in that matrix and have really never known anything other than that, it's there's something, I think, maybe noxious about it that I worry about. On the one hand, young people know that if they post stuff in social media or they say something, they could be being filmed on the street or something like that. They know that stuff can spread very quickly, but they also don't have that, that awareness all the time. And I think there's not as much awareness too about how permanent everything out there is. And then the ones that are aware of that, I'm sure that must have kind of a dampening effect on them. They have to be worried about, is somebody watching me at this point in time? Not even is the government watching me, or is Apple watching me, or Facebook, or some, one of the big tech giants. But are all these other people that I live with, some of whom might have something negative to say about? It doesn't even have to be something that you say or something that you do. It could just be what you're wearing, or how you're walking, or who. I see people getting called out on Twitter just for following somebody else, and because they belong to you follow this person and they have these views, therefore you must be endorsing them, and you might be following just so you can keep tabs on them. Yeah. I actually get Trump's newsletter in my email every day, and take a look at it because I want to see what this guy is selling as the new Republican line of the day. Yeah. But somebody could look at that and be like, yeah, he's a Trump supporter because of that. And so we're in this pervasive environment of constant vulnerability to criticism. And it's really, it's weird. It's not. When I said that, I thought about communist China during the Great Leap Forward, and these meetings that people would be dragged to, where then they'd be criticized by all their neighbors and their children, and they'd have to denounce themselves. It's not centralized like that. Instead, we're just subject to having all of these potential jerks who want to weigh in on anything that we want to say. There's a corresponding, side benefit. We can get support from unusual places that we didn't expect. People can be quite nice and boost you, and you could have people make contacts for you who are like, wow, this person's saying something really good. You should take a look at this. But there is that negative side of it that wasn't present as we were growing up.
I wonder how that impacts, somebody like China who's still alive. Does that sway him in determining whether or not he wants to release?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a. Yeah. I mean, he's a public figure. He's been out there so much over the years, and he's a committed Marxist. So, where he stands. So anything that he does where there's some sort of identifiable Marxist theme or pushing anything progressive, people are always going to be, it's that stupid Marxist again, Right. Yeah.
I wonder if that makes him ever want to just give up, or if that just spurs him on. It was interesting when you
or
were
maybe
talking,
both, depending on the day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you were talking about with Veronica, too, during that.
Veronica Roth, yeah.
Yeah, because back to talking about the anxiety or whatever, and she said, too, how she was wondering how her next book was going to be received. Would the fan base support it? Were they going to turn from her?
Yeah, that's an interesting...
Yeah.
If you're successful as an author, or any sort of creative type, this happens to bands a lot with music too, right?
Yeah.
You make something, your heart is in it, it's what you need to create at that time, and somehow it gets traction because people are like, this is actually pretty good. And now you're locked in. And here's an ethical question. I think a lot of fans feel as if creators have a moral obligation to keep creating within that universe or that style. But as an artist, do you have any sort of obligation? I mean, your fans have been the ones who have spread your works and image and probably paid your paychecks in many ways, right? So do you have to keep on doing things that way? And go ahead.
So I was just saying, that's part of too, the paychecks. Authors, especially if they're in a contract with a publisher, can only keep publishing books with that publisher if the books are selling.
Right.
So sometimes fans are writing to authors like, I was really looking forward to book 5 in the series. What happened? They're like, the publisher dropped the series because it wasn't selling enough.
Yeah. That's interesting. And you could get pressure from the publisher and the editors saying, oh man, we really love this sort of experimental stuff that you do, but maybe not in our series, The fan base is really looking for this, and I, on the side, personally, I love this creative stuff that you're doing, but can you just keep it over there as a side project, Yeah. I personally, I don't think that they have an obligation to keep going down a particular path unless they've declared that they're going to, or I suppose if you say like George R.R. Martin, right? There's a good example.
Yeah.
Is he off the hook for books 6 and 7? I don't feel he is. I think he should finish the series out, but that's because he said he would, right? So maybe once you say that you will, you kind of owe people. But does China Mieville have to write another Bas-Lag novel? He could write 20 more, sort of doing what Iain Banks did with the Culture series, but I don't think he has to.
So the one that's coming out right now, does he know anything about that one?
I don't know anything about it other than the title.
Okay.
So I expect it's a nonfiction, book of Marxist historiography, I imagine. Or maybe it's taking the stock of where Europe currently is. I mean, if you think about it, which specter is it? Is the specter communism? Probably not. Maybe it's fascism.
Yeah,
maybe it's Russia. As a matter of fact, good. I'll get to use this other passage that I put, and then we probably should start wrapping up. He talks about this being particularly terrible days. He's talking about dystopia, and he says it's hard to avoid the sense that these are particularly terrible days, and that dystopia is bleeding vividly into the quotidian, and hence presumably into realism, if that was ever a category in which one was interested. At this point, however, comes an obligatory warning about the historical ubiquity of the questionable belief that things have got worse, and of the sheer arrogance of despair, the aggrandizement of thinking that one lives in the worst times. Hot on the heels of that, we need a counter-corrective to a no less arrogant assumption that things will likely be all right, out of fear that thinking otherwise would indeed be arrogant. So he's saying we got to avoid two different things. We got to avoid the constant thing that he's right. If you look at like literature and history, people are always complaining about how their time is garbage, and the good old days were then, and then
children do not respect their elders, and everyone is writing a book, as someone said in ancient Rome, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Seneca.
Okay. I just liked that the widespread reading of books was a sign of degeneration.
Yeah. Well, he also thought you shouldn't have too many books. Seneca did. But there's always people who are like, well, somehow we're going to make it through, and that's not cultures that say that don't always make it through, and there's no guarantee that we have to be like, the hyperpower or anything like that. And when we do decline away from that into a more multipolar world, we're going to have a reckoning to deal with, I think, in terms of not just, geopolitics, but economy and stuff like that. So he goes on and he says that, for me, facing all of this stuff, one of the things that he says is that against surrender to the complacency and historical myopia of steady-state politics, of precluding as a real possibility epochal degeneration, there's not in living memory been a better time to be a fascist, he says. I think these are dreadful, sadistic times, getting worse, although with abrupt and salutary counter-tendencies, and there's no reason their endpoint might not be utter catastrophe. For me, facing that is urgent, as is the deployment of categories such as decadence and barbarism, as in socialism or barbarism. And so he goes on and he says that the horizon is now more visible now to many who had thought themselves insulated if they thought about it at all. And dystopia for some, this is a great line, is utopia for others. So, when we say, oh, they can't possibly mean X because that would be crazy talk, there's plenty of people out there who, that crazy talk, that is the ideal for them. And they're like, yeah, and anything that we take for granted as like having been settled once and for all, like, the Holocaust happened and we shouldn't do that again. There's plenty of people who they actually do believe the Holocaust happened, but they're just in favor of it. They think that was a great thing and it should have gone further, but they'll deny that it was a Holocaust for a while as well, as part of their strategy. And there's no guarantee for any given human tendency that it can't go dark and wrong and bad in some way. So he goes on and he says, here we go. We live in a utopia, it's just not ours. It's perfectly abundantly true that the technocratic, centrist, socially neoliberal project of the Democrats and New Labor is in major crisis, and that in the cracks new forms grow. I mourn that project not one iota. It deserves to die. And then he says, what does not follow, of course, see Trump, is that whatever rises in the rubble is an improvement. Certainly for me, a radical systematic change is the best hope we have for moving away from this system of sadism. And I hold the Alt Center's hope for a return to the status quo rule by adults in the room to be not only an indefensible project, but a doomed one. So yes, a wholly different kind of project, a revolutionary one, an upheaval, an overturning of existing social priorities and dynamics is what we deserve, and the unhesitant demand for it is by far our best hope. So he said that in 2018 in this strategy for ruination. And I think he does have his finger on the pulse of something that's quite real. I think a lot of people did vote for Trump or voted for the Tories or UKIP or things like that, or other parties and other platforms, because they're like, well, this stuff is garbage. I don't see it attending to me. Let's shake things up. But shaking things up, that isn't necessarily going to work for good. There has to be some content there, something determinate that says, here's what we actually are standing for, and then that opens you up to criticism. How are you going to pay for that? That's the big one here, right? And if you do that, isn't that marginalizing? You're going to undo the marginalization of these people. Well, you're just marginalizing these people over here. That's another common trope as well. I guess this is a good thing to end on. In these, and that Iron Council is different in that respect, right? There isn't any we're all in it together. I guess there is a bit of that in the Scar, right?
Here and there, yeah.
With the people of Armada, but they have to sort their stuff out. And Bellis leaves. She doesn't identify with Armada in the end. I don't see that in here. But maybe there has to be something like that in the end coming out of this story, or maybe this is in some respect a different side project compared to what he was just talking about there, the world that we're living in.